Next, we are going to move on to another presentation on the topic of sexual abuse and exploitation of boys, breaking the silence. We are joined by two of our GAHTS members today. Jarrett Davis, I'm going to pin you, and then I was going to pin Glenn as well, but Jarrett is a GATS senior research scholar who brings over a decade of field research focused on boys, young men, and street-connected children affected by trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation across Southeast Asia and the United States. And then he is also joined by Dr. Glenn Miles, who is another GATS senior research scholar, who is here, sorry, switching to sharing content, trying to make sure I have all of everything on the screen. But Glenn Miles is another GATS senior research scholar and a senior researcher with UP International, who has facilitated a series of research projects listening to survivors of sexual exploitation, both prostituted men, women, boys, girls, transgender individuals, and male sex buyers. So thank you both to Jarrett and Glenn for being here for this important conversation. And Jarrett, I will hand it over to you to start this topic.
Sure. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to see everybody. I'm Jarrett Davis, and I think Glenn's actually going to be the first one to present here, but he's around.
I'm here.
Oh, you are. Oh, there you are. Hi. I was like, I didn't see him. Yeah, I'm Jarrett. So anyway, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jarrett. I'm as you said, a senior research scholar. Glenn and I have been working together for the past 10, 15 years, doing a number of studies, largely on vulnerability of boys and young men in Philippines, Cambodia, and Thailand. The last 7 years, 5 years, I've moved to, now based in New York, and I'm doing research working here. Let Glenn jump in.
Yes, so we're really we really appreciate the opportunity of talking to you about the exploitation of men and boys. It just continues to be a problem, and I've been working on this issue for over 20 years now, and it's not really improving. And of course, now we have added things that are causing it to be funding to be less available, so that makes it even more vulnerable. I'm going to start by talking to you about the research that we've done specifically with street-involved children in Southeast Asia. There's a Cambodian proverb that says, "Boys are like gold and girls are like white linen. If gold falls in the mud, it can easily be wiped clean, whereas white linen will be ruined forever." Now, the first look at that proverb makes you think, well, boys have it good and girls have it not so good. But the reality is that what that means to boys is that if they experience bad things, then they are expected to just get up, brush it down, and get on with it. So they're not allowed to be vulnerable. They're not allowed to cry. They're not allowed to express their feelings. And so it becomes very difficult when it comes to trying to understand their situation, because they are seen as not vulnerable and resilient. Of course, the other side to that, which we won't be talking about today, is that for girls, they are seen as totally vulnerable, and so then they don't have agency. But that's another topic. So this research that we did it in 6 different cities, in 3 countries, over a period of 2014 to 21. And it involved 386 total participant street children. So it was 6 cities in 3 countries. Yeah. So what we found is that in a lot of cases, sexual exploitation of boys was even higher than girls. Sometimes it was a lot more. So, for example, here, this figure, 56% of males versus 26% of females. It's kind of alarming, and I think a lot of people still find it difficult to believe it, but it's true. And so, what are the factors that contribute to that? Well, in Chiang Mai, you have a lot of hill tribe communities. These are young people who may they don't even have they're not even citizens effectively because many of them are not don't have the opportunity to be registered, and the Thai government treat uh, tribes people as less than Thai, what they consider to be Thai, who they consider to be Thai people. So that automatically puts them into a vulnerable position before they've even started. Chiang Mai is also highly dependent on the tourism industry, and that creates a demand in itself. And then boys tend to work, whereas girls have experience a little bit more protection. Boys work independently with less supervision and greater exposure to exploitation. So, if in that particular example in Chiang Mai, you've got other supporting data was males experience sexual touching 54% compared to 29% of girls. And then CSEC was 56% and 26%. And that situation with CSEC in Bangkok was 50% and then 30% of females. So it's all there and it's happening a lot more. Carry on. Thanks, Jarrett. Another thing that we found was out of the 6 cities, Poi Phet, which is on the border between Thailand and Cambodia, experienced the highest rate of CSEC. That's child sexual exploitation. Sorry, commercial sexual exploitation of children. And one of the issues with there is casinos. The average migration age for children it was 6.5 years, which makes it the youngest age. And that what happens is you have Thais coming to the border because they're not allowed to do gambling in Thailand, and so they so a lot of families end up migrating to that area. It's really the Wild West, and it's been like that for all the time that I've worked in Cambodia, which is over a period of about 25 years now. Children migrate there. The casino there is what is known as umbrella children. So umbrella children are what ostensibly they are children who carry umbrellas and then help people go from their hotel to from their bus to the hotel. In reality, they're being sexually exploited as well. So the casino economy creates concentrated demand, and then there's no legal protection for children who cross the borders. The border guards just there is a way in which children can get across the border without having to go through the legal normal legal route. And then of course they're separated from their family, so there's no protective oversight, and children go end up working in gangs. Some of them are helping. There's also a Thai market on the other side of the border where children literally pushing carts of goods from one border to the other. So it's an incredibly vulnerable area. Next one, please. So I think we were. I think we did we do the next one, or was it the second that we might have got slipped over
I
one?
went forward 2 and then back 1. So
Okay. Okay, that's good. That's fine. Thank you, Jarrett. So yeah, there was one study we did that we entitled "They Didn't Help Me, They Shamed Me," and this was about children in Manila. Now, the experience of children in Manila is that they felt incredibly ashamed about the experiences that they'd had, and it's one of the highest incidents of police violence. So that's very disturbing. Over 55.7% experienced police violence, which shows you the kind of state that it is. It's a very disturbing figure. Sexual violence was 51% as well, and the average age at the first abuse was 11.1%. So that yeah, they just in terms of trying to get help, it's the children are not find it very hard to seek help. They're not going to seek it from the police for a start, and there are many NGOs that are trying to help, but not many of them are focusing on boys. So you have this kind of non-tourism economy. Is not Manila itself doesn't have where the tourists want to go. It's out in the other areas. So it's urban poverty driven basically, and 70% of the street children are boys. 80% have no family contact at all, compared to 63% of girls. It tends to be the boys that get sent into the city to find work. And then there's this very strong Catholic patriarchal model where male victimization is considered to be taboo. So that links to what we said before. It's very similar in that males are not allowed to be considered victims. And rescue operations are about detention, not protection. You don't you don't rescue to help. You rescue to detain them and to keep them out off the street. And so it's more of a punishment. It's like a prison. Next one. Thanks. So then other cities, Phnom Penh, big urban poverty thing. It does have a little bit of tourism, but not very much. And we had a mixed gender sample there of 95 children, and 70% of children said that they had experienced violence from their teachers. Now that means that some of the street children would be on the street because of their teacher violence. When teacher violence is so it actually it really upsets me that about this, because my PhD research was looking at corporal punishment against and it included looking at it was about violence against children, including sexual abuse and trafficking, but it also looked at corporal punishment of children by teachers. And at that point, I actually presented the research that I had to the Senate, and the Senate and it was agreed that it wouldn't just be policy, but there would be law that teachers weren't allowed to use violence against children in the classroom. And yet this is 20 years later, and it's still there. Teacher violence, yeah, parent violence is also very high. And there's a detention centre where there's abuse and forced labour and even deaths. Sihanoukville is along the border, and there is tourism there. And the sample that we had there was 89% of males. And this is we found that 35% had experienced sexual touching, 42% had experienced alcohol use, and 90% drug use. Compared to, you can see the comparisons there with the girls, much lower. Thank you, Jarrett. So when you look at the violence across different sites, you've got 77% Phnom Penh, 66% Phoi Phet, 61% Chiang Mai, 55% Sihanoukville. This is not these. I mean that's over half for every city. Police violence over half in Metro Manila, 55%. Teacher violence, 70.5%. So, and what in my previous research as well, we found that children who experience corporal punishment, for example, they were more likely to experience sexual abuse in the future. So it does have a composite effect. Okay, next one, please. So it's not just in Asia, and I want to Jarrett to talk about the situation in right now that's happening in the States.
Yeah. I'm sure that maybe as we've gone through some of these statistics, some of these sound familiar. If anyone has been tuning into any current events recently, we often talk about patriarchy as a system that benefits men. But the masculine scripts that it enforces literally are killing boys. So men die by suicide at 4 times the rate of women. And it's not because men face 4 times the hardship. It's because boys are trained from birth to suppress every emotion except anger, at least a lot of us are, to never ask for help, to handle it themselves or die trying. And many of them do die trying. Research also shows us that we're in a loneliness epidemic. In 1990, 55% of men had 6 or more close friends. By 2021, 27%. Now that's a collapse by half in about 30 years. And the percentage of men with 0 close friends went up from 3% to 15%. It's a 5-fold increase in complete isolation. 5-fold. This is what research calls the man box. It's a rigid set of socially enforced beliefs about what it means to be a real man. This comes through all of our research in Asia as it does here. Things like self-sufficiency, acting tough, never being vulnerable, being hypersexual, being in control. Researchers at Equimundo, who we've been with on a number of occasions, have been tracking this for years. And they found that men who score highest on the man box scale, which is the ones who internalize these rigid norms the most, are significantly more likely to meet the screening standards for depression and suicidal ideation. So the scripts that we use to define manhood are the scripts that are killing boys. And then we're confused when they don't show up in trafficking caseloads. We built systems designed to miss them, and we're succeeding. So when a boy is being exploited, so this scripting often means that he can't recognize the experience as exploitation because victims are weak, and well, he's not weak. He can't report it because asking for help is failure. He can't access services because the very act of walking through that door would mean admitting that he's a victim. So if you look at this number, only 16% of boys identify their experience of abuse as abuse. This is compared to 64% of girls with the same exact documented abuse history, the same trauma, but a completely different ability to name it. So this comes from a landmark longitudinal study, Wisdom and Morris, where researchers compared court-substantiated child abuse cases against adult recall. They weren't asking if they thought they'd been abused. They had proof. So 84% of men with documented sexual abuse histories did not label it as abuse when they were interviewed decades later. It's not amnesia. They remember the events, but they had to reframe them as learning experiences, as hazing, bad luck, anything but victimization. Because to be a victim is, for most men, to fail the test of manhood. So in our Metro Manila study, for instance, 86.5% of the boys felt ashamed about their experiences. Throughout all the questions on sexual violence, all those who declined to respond were male. Even in confidential research, boys actively avoid disclosure. And this is what I like to call the invisibility script. So the socialized belief that men can't be victims. So when a boy is abused, he experiences a double trauma. He has the abuse itself, and then the collapse of his gender identity. So to survive, he must reject one of the 2 realities. So either he's a victim, which means he's not a man, or he's a man, which means that he wasn't a victim. So to preserve that male identity, he often chooses option 2. So once that happens, the victim's stoicism then becomes a trafficker's greatest ally. Boys are taught to take it like a man, to endure pain without complaint. When the victim effectively polices himself into silence, doesn't take other people. So what does this identification gap actually mean for the systems that are trying to find and support these boys? This is coming from my research in Minnesota. So it means massive delays, and those delays work both ways. There is a personal delay. So on average, this is countrywide, so male survivors wait 21 years to first tell anyone what happened to them. Not to seek therapy or go to services, just to mention it to a single person. So it's 21 years of silence. So now we kind of understand like those isolation rates, those high isolation rates that we talked about, really work in traffickers' favor here. And there's also a service delay. So in our Minnesota research, we found that even when boys were in the system on caseloads known to child welfare, the providers often don't identify the exploitation. One service provider told us that they've had this youth on their caseload for 2+ years. And now they wanted to connect them to supportive resources. But that's 2 years of missed opportunity. We found actually that on average, there was this 2-year delay between when they say that they first experienced abuse and when they then, like they were in the system, but then they actually came out and said it. These are kids that are already in the system. So boys delay disclosure because they can't name what happened. And then systems often delay identification because they're not trained to see it. So prevalence data tells us that roughly 1 in 3 to 4 abuse survivors are male. But in therapy settings, it's 7 to 1, female to male. The difference between those ratios is the invisible population. Boys who are suffering in silence, are uncounted by support services, they're invisible to trafficking interventions. And for those of us who work in identification, if your screening tool asks, have you been abused? Have you been trafficked? You will get false negative rates of nearly 84%. That's informed the way that we've actually designed a lot of our surveys. Because with boys with documented abuse histories will say no, not because they're lying, but because they genuinely don't identify what happened to them as abuse. And research shows that, when you use behavioral descriptions, like, behavioral descriptions. So instead of like the semantic labels, when you ask, did someone make you do something sexual instead of were you abused, the disclosure rates then rise dramatically. And the barrier is linguistic, and it's often based in their identity. So men will admit to the facts while rejecting the meaning. And then the boys who survive the system, they often become the men who enforce it. Excuse me. Look at who's going, for instance, like you've seen the news, look at who's going door to door right now. ICE agents, police officers, many of them are also products of this same masculinity crisis, operating from fear, not strength. They're operating from fragility, often dressed up as authority. And some of these are Black and brown men too, also surviving that same broken system, but now with a badge. So they're not excused by this, but they are maybe explained by it. The system produces both the exploited and the enforcers of that system. So for Black and brown boys, so this adds another layer. So they know exactly how, especially in the US, the carceral system works, how it responds to male bodies that look like theirs. So Black boys are 47% of juvenile detention, despite being 14% of the youth population. The system doesn't ask, is this child a trafficking victim? It asks, what crime did the child commit? And we've seen it. Those of us who are, if you're social workers and you work in this area, trafficking indicators like running away, truancy, substance abuse, acting out, get read as criminality. Boys get labeled as pimps, not victims. They're labeled as delinquents, not survivors. So the calculation then becomes, if I stay silent and stay exploited, that's the choice, or I can speak up and risk incarceration. And it's not paranoia. It's often a rational response to a system that is designed to criminalize their existence. Right now, that system is in overdrive. We have ICE going door to door, detaining 56,000 people daily. I think it was in June that they hit that. 79% are single adult males. 72% have no criminal history. None. Men and boys, especially black and brown men and boys, are being swept up, detained, disappeared into a network of camps across the country. That sound familiar? Many are trafficking victims, labor trafficking victims who were brought here under false promises. No one's asking that question. The carceral system doesn't see trafficking. It sees criminals. It's trained to see them. I'll give you there's an example. Edwisa Cuellar Martinez, Venezuelan laborer in Omaha, Nebraska. So he was subjected to wage theft and exploitive conditions at the New Victorian Inn. So it's a news story. Weeks before the raid, he cooperated with police. He described the trafficking conditions. His testimony was cited in the criminal complaint against the traffickers. So when ICE raided the hotel, he was arrested. DHS labeled him a criminal illegal alien, and he was processed for deportation. That's the message. Cooperate and get deported. And then, this is the last slide here, tying up. For trans and gender diverse youth, the gap isn't just wide, but it's getting wider. It's actively widening. Trans individuals face 4 times the trafficking risk of their cisgender peers, and that's a survey analyzed by the Williams Institute. So 86.2 victimizations per 1,000 for trans people, compared to 21.7 for cisgender people. So that's, at the same time, we know that 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ, family rejection being the primary driver. So all this all throughout our Minnesota studies. So when a kid gets kicked out for who they are, they lose every protective structure, home, school, healthcare, and end up on the streets, where survival sex often becomes the only option. And then in 2025, we had federal policy made everything worse. So on January 20th, 2025, we have executive order, it was 14168, defined sex throughout gender, and just redefined sex in binary biological terms only. Gender identity was entirely excluded from federal policy. Trans identity became legally invisible in federal contexts. See the TIP report, the State Department's flagship anti-trafficking publication that we're all familiar with in this field. They've omitted the LGBTQ plus section for the first time in years. Survivor advocates on the advisory council were told explicitly no information on LGBTQ issues would be included. And then funding cuts to HUD, which is the Housing and Urban Development, came in August. And then and LGBTQ homeless youth all over the nation began losing their transitional housing, which was already scarce. Many of those kids are now back on the streets, where again, survival sex becomes the only option. So it's not abstract, but literally every defunding decision creates conditions where traffickers are able to thrive and grow their businesses. And that's kind of where I'm tying this up here. So it's not that they're invisible. We started this out asking, making the invisible visible. But they're not invisible. We just refuse to look. And the question is, isn't whether they're there. We know that they're there. It's whether we'll look, and oftentimes when we look, we find them. People are exploited, and people also have gender, and that it can look real diverse. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Jarrett, and Glenn, for that great presentation. We have a couple questions already in the chat. Someone asked, Jarrett, I think this is referring to some of the statistics that you had shared, but where does such a high number of cases of violence by law enforcement come from?
Which one?
It was referring to a high number of cases of violence by law enforcement, or was that part of the study that Glenn was talking about?
Oh, that was our Manila study, I think.
Okay.
That was in Manila, and law enforcement was extremely high, and that came with a lot of the detention cleanup things. So kids would be, often beat up, taken into detention. Street working children were particularly seen more as a nuisance than as a human issue.
But this started to come from 3 different NGOs working in different places, so it wasn't like just one little small corner geographically. So it showed the extent of it.
These cases, whether we did these studies, these usually took months and months at a time, and I would be physically living in that city, working physically with all of those organizations, spending time doing community observation. A lot of each of these interviews were very kind of like carefully done with social workers from the local context that often already had trust developed in the communities. Done with a lot of like trauma informed, phrasing and setup and all that kind of stuff. So we've it's that's the, I guess, background of that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more but it probably isn't possible now, but VJ are very interested in your the boys, you were talking about doing dressing up in Bihar, and then making doing dances which then lead on to sexual exploitation. I know I've heard of that in Afghanistan, but I haven't heard of it in India. So that would
It-
be very interesting
yeah.
to
It's a
learn about
practice
that.
that it's a practice you find in India, parts of India, Nepal, Mauritius, wherever
Okay,
the Bihari population migrated. The people
right.
from Bihar,
Okay.
a lot of people from Bihar are in Mauritius. So
Yes.
find that practice in these kind of places.
Okay, that's interesting. Mauritius, wow. Um, yeah, that's very interesting. And then Margaret, what were you were saying about generational abuse? Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
A little bit. I won't get too deep in the weeds with that, but in the US we call it familial trafficking. But I don't want to put too much personal out there. That's why I asked you to privately email me. But
Sure.
we have boys here that go from men and just keep reoffending. It's like I don't know how to explain it really
No,
without
it's all right.
going
I
into
apologize for
private
putting you on the spot.
detail.
Yeah. Yeah, it may need a bit more discreetness about that. So yes, let's talk
Yes.
about that
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Margaret, for sure. I do see another question in the chat. Arena asked, Jarrett, do you think that disclosure delay, you had talked about 21 years that it takes for males to disclose, that could be the reason for more severe trauma with boys compared to girls?
In some cases, it might be. In Poipet and in the studies that we shared, that was probably part of it. A big reason, that one that we identified, um, was that, particularly in high poverty contexts. So if a family has the financial means to take care of 3 children, but they have 5 or 6, and oftentimes family planning is just something that doesn't happen. You'll keep the girls close, social cultural norms, values. You'll keep the girls closer to home. They'll usually work with mom or with dad or with auntie, uncle. Whereas the boys usually are more free to run and play. In Poipet, we saw boys that would, both boys and girls that would cross the border to work in the market on the other side of the border. They would work there, and when we did actually focus group discussions. This wasn't in the study. We did this prior to the study. We did focus group discussion where we talked with boys and girls. Girls report being both would encounter police. The girls would be taken to the detention reintegration center on the border, where they're counted by ILO, counted as a trafficking victim, and brought back, repatriated or brought back to Poipet. Boys, on the other hand, largely, and not just the boys were saying this, but the girls were also describing this about what they've seen, what happened to their brothers, what happened to their, boys often were chased by police. Boys would run. There's one kid that described a boy getting thrown off of a roof. There's quite a bit of violence. A lot of times they will try to run through there's like a river that kind of goes between the Thailand, and so they'll try to run through there. There's like rocky area. A lot of them would get injured. But also they're not then taken, because they're not, when they are apprehended, they'll usually be taken either to other detention, or if they're not caught, then they're just not caught. They might get injured, but they're also not taken to the repatriation, which means they're also not counted as a victim, which also explains how some of those gender ratios can get misbalanced. Because if you're counting served victims, you're just counting served victims. You're not actually counting people who experience trafficking or exploitation or violence or things. You're just counting the victims that you identify and serve. And oftentimes those calls on who you serve is made by a local beat cop in provinces of Thailand, which often come with their own sets of biases and assumptions about what boys are and what girls are. So you can see there's both social and cultural dynamics that are kind of working against the system, but also social and cultural dynamics that are working against them being seen.
Jarrett, I just tie this up, Anna,
Sure.
by saying, I'm very grateful for all of you for joining this call, and I hope that you're convinced that boys need attention. I noticed that Jennifer talked about familial trafficking, and I did some research on that specifically with someone else. Anyway, that was published in the last year, and you can access it through my website, which I think Anna's given you information. And then also, you are Shahid. I hope I'm saying it right. Asked about similarities with trans people, and yeah, we could do a whole nother presentation. In fact, we probably will at some point do another presentation on that. We have done research with trans in Cambodia and Thailand in particular, and we would love to do it actually in the Philippines, because that with the whole other aspect of the Catholic culture, but we need to get funding for that. But we yeah, I mean there's a whole illusion that in Thailand the lady boys are all well respected and liked, and that's our research proved that that wasn't true at all, and they have their own real serious challenges that they have to experience every day, including gang rape. It's not uncommon for them to experience that. And I think similarly in Hijra in India, they also experience gang rape at weddings and so on. So there's there's a lot to be said about that, but maybe that's appropriate for another time. Oh, the other thing I want to say is Chelsea said about she's put in a link there for support for men healing from sexual abuse from the 1 in 6 website. The 1 in 6 website is a very useful website that indicates that 1 in 6 men. It's got international research that's been done widely that demonstrates that 1 in 6 men are sexually abused or as children, and that oh gosh, we got so much there's so much information that we're trying to squeeze in here, but I do appreciate that Chelsea put something about healing, because it isn't, there is the possibility of healing. It's just for boys and young men to actually get access to it. That's an whole other thing.
Thank you, Glenn. They're just going to do one more question before we move on. Boosie in the chat asked, is there a shift in policy or interventions aimed at redressing this, or the way that treatment of boys are experiencing?
Definitely not at the federal level.
Within the states, anything
there was some movement on this. I know that this on the ground is very well, at least it is, there's a split, like, right, it is very well recognized amongst, at least in my experience, among social workers. There's often not a lot of training. There's very limited training that people actually get specifically on men and boys, but there's a push from the grassroots. Whether or not that is, I think a lot of state legislatures, there's been some inroads in different states, and especially Minnesota and some of those places. New York is sadly behind Minnesota and some of those other states. But that's at the state level. At a federal level, that's we're another time.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you both for presenting this really important talk. I like that we are able to talk about these issues that aren't necessarily discussed as much.